Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Julie Noblet. I'm the Energy and Climate Program Director at Acterra. And I want to thank you so much for coming tonight for the second in our spring 2019 Acterra lecture series. And you're here to hear Khalid Kadir, who's going to be talking about innovating our way to climate justice, ? If Acterra is unfamiliar to you, I want to just say one word about it. We are an environmental nonprofit, and next year we're going to be celebrating our 50th anniversary. We were in fact founded on Earth Day in 1970. And we've done a lot of things in that time, but today we have a laser focus on climate change, making it faster, easier, cheaper for all of us to mitigate the main sources of carbon emissions. And to that end, we have several programs, a Go EV program to encourage people to get into electric vehicles. We have a Green at Home program to teach people how to conserve energy and electrify their home. We recognize businesses that go above and beyond with their sustainability efforts with our Business Environmental Awards program, which is 30 years old, and I'm here to invite you to a big party on Wednesday, May 22nd. We're having our awards ceremony and reception. You really don't want to miss it. It's in San Francisco, and it's always a really good time. So before I turn this over to Khalid, I want to thank a few people. A couple of thank yous are in order. So first of all, our lecture series underwriters, Mary and Clinton Gilliland and Armand and Eliane Nukermans. We want to thank them very much for underwriting this series. Thank you. Our other sponsors include the Bay Area Air Quality Management District and the Foster Art and Wilderness Foundation provide this venue, they provide the snacks. It is an amazing place, so thank you to the Foster. I'd also like to have a special thanks tonight to Presidio Graduate School for Sustainable Management. I'm an alum. I can tell you it's a fabulous place to get your MBA in sustainable management, systems thinking, triple bottom line thinking. They're a great thought partner for Acterra. So yes, if you're considering a green career, pick up their materials. And I'd like to thank the Acterra staff and volunteers. If you work for Acterra or volunteer for Acterra, will you please raise your hand? Look at all these wonderful people. Thank you very much. And especially Gwen Casriel, who's worked very hard on putting the series together. So with no further ado, can we switch over to Khalid's slides? I'd like to introduce Khalid Kadir. He's a professor and program director at Presidio Graduate School. His teaching and program development takes an intersectoral approach to understanding our most important sustainability and social justice challenges. He's developed a really innovative interdisciplinary engineering course at UC Berkeley that trains future engineers to engage with the social and political roots of their technical work. He won the 2014 Chancellor's Award for Public Service for Service Learning Leadership. And in addition to his teaching, he's consulted with nonprofit organizations on environmental sustainability, water, sanitation, and poverty. So, Khalid has agreed to stay afterwards for some Q&A. Please hold your questions to the end. We'll pass you microphones. And with no further ado, let me turn it over to Khalid.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming out on a weeknight to listen to me. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. We'll find out. I'm working with 3 different pieces of technology at once, so if I make a mistake, just yell at me. I have sort of, as you mentioned, I have a bit of an unusual way that I come to this work. My training's as an environmental engineer, so on the very technical side. But towards the end of my time in graduate school, I spent a lot of time wondering you know, and I'm guessing for those of you in the audience, like we already know a lot about what to do right and what's not to do when we think about the environment. It's not really that complicated. Don't pour your oil down the street, and you know, recycle. Those are the basics. And even the more complicated things about using less energy, we already know that sort of stuff. It's not. We don't need more scientists to tell us that. But yet, these things aren't really happening to the extent maybe we want them to. So I started trying to understand, well, why is that? And it made me start thinking about the context of our work, the social and political context of our work. And so that's sort of the angle that I'm going to come into this today. And I'm going to start with, it works, a couple of quotes, just to sort of set the tone of what I'm trying to get at here today. The first is by one of my favorite journalists, George Monbiot. When someone says they have no politics, it means that their politics align with the status quo. And I come out of a discipline where people have no politics, so they think. You know, we're just engineers. We're just trying to do this good work. We're not trying to get into the political side of it. And this really stood out as a way of responding to that. He continues on, none of us are unbiased, none removed from the question of power. We're social creatures who absorb the outlook and opinions of those with whom we associate, and we're all in good company, and unconsciously echo them. Objectivity is impossible. And then the famous Howard Zinn, you can't stand still on a moving train, maybe getting at it a little more eloquently. So climate change is nothing new. From the latest IPCC report, global mean temperature has warmed about 3/4 of a degree Celsius in the past 100 years. More than half of this warming has happened since 1979. Here we're just looking out of the latest report showing the amount of warming in different areas of the world. It's unequivocal. We know that human action is doing that. And it's interesting that we're consistently exceeding our own expectations of how warm it's going to get. I'm waiting for someone to take the 5 IPCC reports and graph their predictions and then graph the actual, so that then with the 6th report we can say, well, what do we actually expect? You know, how much higher than the prediction do we think it's going to be? And so just a little bit of science around it. This is looking at the Arctic sea ice extent, the area of the ocean that has about 15% ice. In many ways, the Arctic's a bellwether because the poles are warming more quickly than the equator. Shrinking ice sheets contribute to sea level rise. And a note that the tools that are available out there to understand this stuff are amazing now. The websites, when I was preparing this, just looking at the accessibility of data that's interactive. In this one, you can click whatever years you want to look at and see what the Arctic sea ice was at every year. And so here, the gray line is the median from 1981 to 2010. And the gray box is the interdecile range. Now that's a little bit complicated. That means that the 10 to 90% range. So between 10 and 90% of the time from 1981 to 2010, it was in that sort of gray box. And then I just picked a couple years. 2012 is notoriously the one that had the largest loss of sea ice. But 2018, and you see where we're at with 2019, that it's melting much faster than it ever has in history. Not exactly news, I assume, to many of us here. Next, I want to look at another way of showing a similar phenomenon, but instead of looking at just the ice, now we're looking at volume. So initially, people spent a lot of time looking at, like, where's the ice and is it there or not? But then they started realizing that it's also melting from below. And so even if the top shrinks a little, it might actually shrink a lot more if it's gotten thinner. And so this is looking at the total volume of sea ice, and it really demonstrates the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, how much the sort of volume has been decreasing steadily over time. And then perhaps one of the more famous photos or images, this is looking at the concentration of sea ice. The whiter it is, the heavier the concentration, and the yellow line is the 1981 to 2010 median of where the total sea ice was. So all of this has normally been ice, it's now water. So we see these sort of ice caps disappearing. A recent report came out last year, estimates that, and this is another one of those funny statistics, the recent IPCC report used far too conservative of an estimate of Antarctic ice melt. And in fact, we're not looking at 1 meter of climate change, but more like 2.3 meters by 2100. So that's 7 feet of sea level rise. So we're looking at a pretty big uphill battle. So it's not just about warming. This is sort of really starkly showing some of the effects we see. Heat accelerates the hydrological cycle, and now we're seeing the incidence of floods that are occurring by continent, and the data sort of speaks to itself here, pretty straightforward. There we go. And we can also look at another effect CO2 has, ocean acidification. Here's from the Pacific Science Association looking at the change in sea surface pH. Now, usually most of us probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about what the effect of pH has and why that is or isn't important, but it's extremely important. Minor changes in pH have major effects on the ability of organisms living in the ocean. The basic process here, if you've done any chemistry, the more CO2 you have in the atmosphere, it sort of pushes that down the chain. A higher partial pressure of CO2 leads to higher concentrations of dissolved CO2 in the water, which then pushes the ocean in the acidic direction. The most obvious and the sort of the front line of this problem is coral reefs. They're very likely to be extinct within our lifetime because they can only tolerate a very narrow range of pH and temperature. And reefs serve as a nursery for many of our fisheries. In addition, these changes in pH are moving where plankton live. They can't live in all of the same places, so they're either dying off or dramatically changing where they live and where they don't live. And you can imagine how that scales up the food chain as that goes. Now, why is all of this happening? I think this is a useful image to show because it gets a sense of the mass balance. In order to understand climate change, we have to understand the radiative balance of the Earth, the amount of solar radiation coming in and where all of that ends up. And it's also helpful to understand the carbon cycle. We're not going to go there right now. But here we're looking at sort of solar radiation coming in and the different things that happens to it. Getting absorbed by the surface, getting absorbed in the atmosphere, and then radiation emitted by the surface and coming back from the atmosphere. And here you can see this is where greenhouse gases play a role. They hold more heat and they emit that back down into the Earth's lower atmosphere. So I just want to sort of put out there, just getting a quick look at this. What pieces of this are we changing? Are humans changing? What do you imagine? Yeah. Yeah, the amount of back radiation from greenhouse gases is the sort of most important one that we're changing. What else are we changing here? What else do you think might change? Yeah. Totally. So the surface reflectance is changing a lot, and that leads to a lot more sort of thermals coming out, and that's partly because of urban sprawl, and it's partly because of deforestation. So as we change the surface of the Earth, we change what happens to the energy that comes down to the Earth. So the third big thing that we're changing is by pollution in the atmosphere, like actual physical pollution, particles in the air. We're changing the amount of aerosols, and that affects scattering that happens of radiation in the atmosphere. It changes the absorbance and it changes the reflectance. And just a quick, you may have heard that one solution people are putting out there is put a lot of sulfur in the atmosphere, and that'll reflect it back out. That's because sulfur and nitrate reflect incoming radiation. On the other hand, something black carbon like chimney soot, that has the opposite effect. If it's black carbon, it absorbs that radiation and then it holds it down here into the atmosphere. Organic carbon can go either way depending on what's underneath it. So just gives you a sense of it's actually a really simple equation here. We're looking at energy coming in and where it all goes, and there aren't that many places, and there's basically three of them we're changing. What's going on in the atmosphere, the surface of the Earth, and then the particles in the atmosphere. With that in mind, I'm gonna a common response to this in a lot of sort of environmental circles is, we can do this, and here's how. And I'm not trying to pick on Project Drawdown here. Let me start by that. But they're a good example of what I think part of the problem is, and I think they exemplify this in a lot of ways. They saw a problem, like many sort of problem-solving minded engineers. The Earth is getting warmer. They rolled up their sleeves, and they started to figure it out. Okay, how can we stop that from happening? How can we fix this problem? In the process, they've got a large movement built around what they believe will save the planet and save the human race. And today I want to challenge this approach. I think this approach is wrong. And I think it stems from a kind of blindness mixed together with a little bit of savior attitude that's usually more about the savior than the thing they're saving. And I think, in fact, that may seem harsh, but I actually think it's worse than that. I actually think it's unjust. This approach completely misidentifies our climate problem. And in doing so, the proposed solutions not only fall short, but in fact, they reinforce the very things that are causing the climate problem we see today. So that's kind of the big picture thesis I'm going to throw out there, but I'm going to explain this in sort of 3 stages. First, I'm going to share just a concept that I want to use here, this idea of rendering technical. And then I want to talk about climate in a very different way than I started out this talk, and think about climate as a social issue and as a political issue, and in the frame of climate justice or injustice. And then I want to think about how can we move from trying to do social good work and do climate work that is about, how do we innovate for good, and instead think about justice, and how might we innovate for justice, and how might we do social justice work. So to start, the first step here, we're thinking about this idea of rendering technical. So what, next slide please. What is this? What does this look like? Don't overthink it. It looks like a box, right? Someone saw that video. As an engineer, we were trained to draw these boxes. And it was amazing when I first read about this process rendering technical, which I'll explain in a minute. It really shocked me, and I thought, wow, that's like a large part of my graduate time in school was spent drawing boxes exactly like this. Technical experts generally try to approach problems by drawing boxes like this. And then with the box, we look at, next one, thanks. We look at what's coming in and what's going out. Generally, it's the problem coming in and the thing we're solving going out. One example, and we call this box, we have a name for it, we call it a control volume. We might have hot air coming in and cold air coming out. What's inside the box? Right, refrigeration and air conditioner, right? So that's generally the approach we use. And this is like a tried and true way of solving engineering problems. And part of the process is that when we do this, we are making what I'm going to say is a political statement. We're claiming that everything outside of that box doesn't matter. It's not related to the problem at all. And if it's hot air coming in and cold air coming out, we might get along with that. Okay, I'm not really concerned about what's happening in the ocean when I'm just trying to cool down my house. But this process of drawing boxes, it turns things into a technical problem, and it defines the thing we're trying to solve in strictly technical terms. So the problem with that is that it results in a lot of exclusions. So we draw boxes around problems for very good reasons. We draw boxes around these problems to simplify them. But when we do this simplification, we exclude a number of things. We leave out history. We leave out context, and we don't think about relationships of power. So this is I'm drawing on the work of Tanya Lee, and she calls this rendering technical, and she argues that it's premised on a technical social dualism. The idea that there's a place in the world to do social things, and there's a place in the world to do technical things. And these are not related to one another. And we even inscribe this inside of our institutions. You take a math class, you learn about math. You take a history class, you learn about history. But there's not a thought about, can we think about the history of mathematics in math class? And can we think about the mathematics of history in a history class? Like, that's very unusual. And we have the social sciences and the natural sciences, and we somehow assume that they're separate in our universities. And in this process, what we're doing to problems is we're depoliticizing them. We're taking things that exist in societies that have complex terrains of power and inequality, and we're turning them into technical problems. And human beings in social categories get reduced to just clients, users, or targets of interventions. And in a way, we might go so far as to say we dehumanize the problem. We don't consider the human element, and we consider it just a technical thing, and how do we get the A to B in this process? This is one piece. The other side of this is that we also leave ourselves out of the problem. When we're trained to draw these boxes, we don't think about how we might be implicated into the problem, the thing happening inside the box, or the solution. We often don't even stop to think about what is my relationship to insert the problem you're trying to solve here. So the results of this is that our innovative solutions are lacking. They're incomplete. Can we just, in fact, by not recognizing the ways in which we're wrapped up in the same problems that we're trying to solve, we can often just reinforce the structures of oppression and marginalization that cause these problems in the first place. And so what I want to ask us is, can we just innovate for good? Can we turn our problem-solving energy towards just doing social good? Sure, but I think we're only going to deal with the symptoms of the problems. We're never going to get at the root cause of the problems. In so much as problems are always specifically tied to context, they have historical precedents to them, and power is a part of the construction of the problem. Techno-fixes will only work around the issue. They won't deal with that question of who has power and who doesn't and why. And I think we'll never stop reproducing the problems whose symptoms we're trying to address. Instead, I think we need to rethink our orientation to innovation. And I want to draw on an op-ed written in the New York Times last year by Casey Gerald. In it, he described how he was the poster child of the American dream. A black child born into poverty, played football at Yale, went on to work on Wall Street, then in the Obama administration. He didn't see himself as a symbol of the American dream, however. Instead, he sees his story as the exception, not the rule. And towards the end of this piece, he has a really beautiful line. He says, we need to stop substituting hopeful stories for justice. And I think that's something we need to think about when we try to address climate. I think we need to stop substituting hopeful stories of hey, look at how we decreased emissions in this place over here, and asking questions about justice is, what is the basis for those emissions? Why are they there in the first place? Who are they supporting? And at whose expense? And while innovation for good is certainly well-intentioned, and it may bring us stories of hope and specific cases of individual successes, I think it falls short. And instead, I want to argue in the spirit of Gerald's piece that we need to move towards innovation for justice, specifically for innovation towards social justice. So in that, I'm going to explain where that ties into climate change a little more clearly. That was the more abstract part. Climate change is a social justice issue. Sure, it has technical manifestations, and I started to talk off with some of those, but more importantly, it has human manifestations. In our effort to tackle the climate problem, I think we should start with the human side of it. Now, I'm not going to give you a complete picture of climate justice, but I'm going to try and give you just a little window into the human side of the issue, and then start to think how we might change the way we think about our work to address climate change. So here we're looking at an infographic of energy emissions or climate emissions from different nations. Emissions in 2009 were down due to the economic crisis. Since then, they've gone back up. Here in this infographic, they show China as number 1 and US as number 2. Now, if you were in charge of China, why would you be concerned about emissions caps based on these aggregate emissions? This is total aggregate emissions from these different countries, and we might say, well, if we just got China, India, and the US in control, we might be set. Why might China be a little hesitant to say, put caps on our emissions? So Perfect. So, and I'm going to add a D then. First, the U.S. is still #1 per capita. When you have 1 billion people over here and 300 million over there, it changes the equation a little. Second, these as you mentioned, this is very ahistorical. It doesn't think about the level of development and who's living how, and that's tied to this third one. These are production-based, not consumption-based. Why is China emitting so many climate gases? For us to buy the things that they make. And so thinking about climate as these, and I think a lot of these kinds of images get thrown around, and a lot of emphasis is on, oh, we need to think about India, we need to think about China, these are going to be the big problem spaces. China's only producing things to sell it to us. And sure, Chinese middle class is growing, and there's a conversation to have there, but if you look at consumption-based emissions, the equation gets even farther along. Now, in addition to that, we can look at the unequal responsibility. This is a cartogram comparing cumulative CO2 emissions by country from 1950 to 2000. And you can see here sort of the total emissions. This is a way of trying to demonstrate climate debt. Basically, the size of the debt each country owes for using more than its fair share of CO2. If everybody had been using their fair share of CO2 by their population size, the countries would have matched the actual sizes here. So you can see, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America are tiny. United States is particularly large. This is one side. This is the unequal responsibility side of who's actually responsible for the emission. But the other and the darker side is that there are also heavily unequal impacts. Here we're looking at a cartogram of the climate change attributable deaths due to only 4 things. This is due to malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and inland flooding. So if we look at these two, the starkness of it, I don't think you can get much more stark than this. You can see who's responsible for the problem and who's literally dying because of the problem already. Not gonna die, not gonna have sea level rise problems, already is having these problems. And it's sort of like two sides of a coin here. And this is no longer really a radical idea. The IPCC's 5th assessment, their most recent assessment, in it, they argue that people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, people who are marginalized in some way are especially vulnerable to climate change. And they go further to say that that this vulnerability is not just because of one reason, but it's intersectional. And they're intersecting social processes that result in these inequalities, including socioeconomic status and income. And they argue that it's gender, class, race, ethnicity, ability, all of these feed into who's suffering from climate change the most. And I like the way they sort of get at it in this graphic where they're getting a sense that you have to think about the hazard. What are the things that might happen? Who's actually exposed to that hazard, and how vulnerable are they? And in there is where we get a sense of the risk. Often, we spend a lot of time thinking about the hazard. Are there going to be floods? Are there going to be fires? But who's exposed to those floods and fires, and what is their vulnerability to those floods and fires? And there are a number of places where people are very, very vulnerable that often aren't the places that are closest to us. Here, we can think about small island nations. That top left photo is a famous move by Dr. Ibrahim Didi, the Prime Minister of the Maldives, when in 2009, he held a cabinet meeting underwater, basically saying, this is my cabinet. This is what's going to happen here. If we're going to exist, it's going to be like this. And we can also think about subsistence people. Here are folks in the Arctic dealing with, and I think this is a little challenging. I like dogs. And here pulling their dog out of the water. And this is because with the thinning ice, that's just even transport and movement is getting difficult for Arctic peoples. Here we're looking at a drought in Brazil in 2005 and all of the dead fish that resulted from that, a drought in Kenya, and displaced people from a drought in Ethiopia. These are subsistence people who are already suffering from the effects of climate change. The folks who rely on fisheries, who rely on rain-fed and glacier-fed agriculture. Moreover, we see climate conflict. And this is a pretty controversial thing because, you know, when you think about any conflict, it's not one reason that causes it, but these are conflicts that in particular climate has been attached to as one of the causal factors. Over here we're thinking about Darfur, and we're thinking, and Darfur some have argued is the first real climate conflict. And the history of that is that there were droughts in Darfur. And when there are droughts and resources are limited, people start fighting over them. It's a pretty normal thing to happen when there's not enough to go around. On the other hand, Syria, and this is from a beautiful comic explaining sort of the history of the Syrian conflict that gained a lot of traction when the author first made it, sort of showing how what happened in the countryside in Syria where there were droughts and people couldn't continue farming. And so they moved into urban areas, but there weren't jobs there for them, and so there was sort of a little bit of civil unrest. And with an authoritarian government and a sort of aggressive military, we see what we have today. So these consequences are highly inequitable, and they're the first in line are those who are most vulnerable. Bringing this home to the US, there's an excellent report by Professor Rachel Morel-Lafroche and some colleagues looking at the effects of the climate gap on people of color and the poor. They suffer from higher mortality rates and higher health impacts, and just a whole list of sort of the things that folks of color and poor folks in the United States are exposed to with climate change. And we're seeing this gap widen, and we're seeing that folks who are poor are paying a greater cost for basic necessities. This, by the way, is one of the arguments for this, if you may have heard of a just transition. Rather than a transition to clean energy, we need a just transition. Because otherwise what happens is those of us who can afford to put solar panels on our roofs or buy solar energy will be okay. When the price of fossil fuel energy goes up, we're okay, we have solar. But everyone who couldn't afford that is now paying higher and higher energy costs. They can't afford green energy, and now their fuel is, their cost to heat their homes, to run their cars is much higher. So thinking about how the cost to those who are sort of most vulnerable go up the most. And finally, that poor folks experience reduced economic opportunities disproportionately so with climate change, and that shifting job opportunities and greater job losses. And perhaps the most sort of the most jarring thing that we've seen in the U.S. around climate change was Hurricane Katrina. And Neil Smith, a geographer, has a famous article, and the title of it is that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. In it, he writes, in every phase and aspect of a disaster, causes, vulnerability, preparedness, the results, the response, and reconstruction, the contours of disaster, and the difference between who lives and who dies is to a greater or lesser extent a social calculus. What killed people in Hurricane Katrina was not Hurricane Katrina. It was the social framework that we had built that set us up for this problem. And that's why some people suffered much more than other people. Smith goes on and he writes, the final lesson of environmental geography concerning disasters is that far from flattening the social differences, disaster reconstruction invariably cuts deeper the ruts and grooves of social oppression and exploitation. So if we're not thinking about the social and political sides of what we're doing, we're only cutting deeper the ruts and grooves of social oppression and exploitation. So I'm not going to leave you with that sort of dark side of it, and I want us to think about how might we productively move forward in this context, where I'm not here I'm sharing this to make the case that climate change is not a technical problem. It's not a problem of carbon dioxide. It's not a problem of methane. It's not a problem of rainfall and drought. It's not a problem of temperature. These are merely the physical manifestations of our social and political relationships. And climate change is the result of social injustice and oppression. It's the result of the dominance and supremacy of some people over others. Look, climate change, who does climate change benefit? It benefits every single one of us in here, right? Like if we drove a car to get here, we needed climate change to do that, right? If you've ever eaten a fruit in the wintertime, a strawberry in the wintertime, climate change benefits you because climate change has to happen to eat strawberries in the wintertime, right? If you've ever fly on a plane to go on vacation, you're benefiting from the same thing that's raising the climate, right? And so thinking about the ways in which some people actually benefit, we don't want that to happen. Don't get me wrong, we don't want climate. We wish we could fly on a plane and not have climate emissions, but to the extent that certain people in the world get to have, big cars, big houses, and vacations on a plane, that's going to cause climate change. And those two can't be separated right now. And so climate change is a direct outcome of a system in which wealthy, primarily Western, and primarily white lives, priorities, comforts, perspectives, beliefs, desires, they're prioritized and valued at the ongoing expense of the bodies of poor people and people of color. Like this happens because, I said this to my dad once. I said, when there was a period in my life when I didn't fly on planes. That period is long gone, and he's very happy because they live in another country. I think he's happy. And I said to him, Dad, what would it be like if I had to shove a young Sudanese girl every time I had to walk onto the plane? What if that's what I had to do? If I had to be faced directly with and of course it's not a one-to-one thing. There's a whole chain of events that happens between me getting on a plane and a drought happening in Sudan. But it would bring that home to me. It would make me think about, do I have to look at the people who are going to be affected in whatever tiny little bit from that one plane trip? And what would it mean for us to not externalize that and to have it come back to us directly? And I think we're not going to solve this problem of oppression and dominance with a technical fix. And even more, that those who are out there promoting all of these technical solutions to climate change, they're getting paid to do this. Like engineers are finding consulting jobs to find ways to lower our emissions, enabling us to continue living the way we live, as opposed to saying, might we think about how can we change the way we live? Can we think about living a different way that doesn't rely on driving all over the place, that doesn't rely on the things that emit the way they do, that maybe no more strawberries in the winter, maybe that's what that means. But can we work towards that world instead of saying, well, how can we get those strawberries more efficiently so that it's a lower carbon footprint on those? So how do we do better? I want us to think about this move from social good to social justice, and I think the first thing we have to think about to do this, and it's actually not that complicated, we just have to think about history. And I think we have to consider how might we rectify historical injustices, and how might we make up for past practices that have resulted in current inequalities. And this opens the space for conversations about things such as reparations. This opens the space for conversations about things such as affirmative actions to rectify the historical trajectories that were based on past injustices. A second thing that I think we need to think about is we need to think about our relationship to oppression and marginalization. And I think we need to think about the fact that poverty is tied to wealth, right? So someone has to be a janitor for this place we're in. And we often don't see the janitors in the places we work, in the places that we move through. In fact, at one place where I teach, not Presidio, I teach in another place as well, the janitors come in at night after dark. So none of the students actually ever encounter a janitor. And so they don't know about the living conditions of janitors. They don't know about the wages. They don't know about how they're treated by the employer that they're paying to go to school there. So thinking about, can we think about how the things that we have ease in our life is based often on the marginalization and oppression of others. And the classic example I use is, I'm not wearing a t-shirt today, but if I was, or this shirt, how is it that I'm able to have as many t-shirts as I have? And what if I had to pay someone a living wage to live in the Bay Area to make t-shirts? I would have a lot less t-shirts because they would be a lot more expensive. So thinking about how my ability to have the t-shirts, the shoes, the whatever I have depends on other people not getting paid enough to have a living wage to do that. And that doesn't feel good. And that's this idea of relationality, that privilege and oppression are related to one another. And the third thing I think that we would benefit from if we want to solve this problem is we can center the voices of the most marginalized folks. We can focus on not taking as much space in the conversation and giving that space to folks who are otherwise shut out of the conversation. Ensuring that those who are most marginalized have a place at the table, and I would argue are sitting in the driver's seat of our plans. But all of this will require, and I'm going to use this big wonky word, an epistemological transformation. I thought the first word was a big one. And epistemology is basically, how do you know what you know? What are the methods through which you know truth, you know reality? It's how is knowledge established? It's really about methods. It's about the methods that we know the world. And why I say this requires us to have an epistemological transformation is I'm arguing that the ways in which we've come to know the world post-Enlightenment have resulted in climate change. We've come to know the world as a thing that is there for us to extract from and use and benefit from, and not to sort of live in harmony with, or not to live in balance with. And I think to go through this kind of transformation and to let go, frankly, of the narrowness of the scientific method, and to start valuing other forms of knowledge that come from communities outside of our own, traditional communities, something that goes beyond the quantitative, something that goes beyond the empirical, the methods that dominate the work of innovators today. But these epistemological transformations have really practical implications. It requires us to ask new and different questions of the work we're doing. It requires us to use different methods to come to understand the, quote, reality of a situation. It requires us to change our curricula, to add new courses, to change the way we teach our courses, to change how and where we do our work, who we work for, and who we're accountable to in our work. And I think some questions we can ask of our work that might help us move in this direction, I think is what motivates our process of innovation when we think about climate innovation? And it's just sort of throwing out 3 examples in here. Are we innovating because there's profit in it, because there's some sort of private market demand that says, hey, there's a demand here, if you deliver, someone's going to pay for it. Now, that's a perfectly fine reason to innovate. There's nothing sort of ethically wrong with that, but is that going to lead us to a road that's more socially just? Not necessarily. Are we innovating because this is a social need and priority, which sometimes will cost more financially than we'll get out of it? But can we make that decision? That, hey, you know what, I'm willing to pay a little more for things because it's the right thing to pay for. Or are we innovating based on principles of justice? And are we innovating because we believe the innovations we're bringing forth will bring out more justice? Maybe on the whole, people will have less, but maybe that less will be distributed in a more just and even equitable way. Another sort of set of questions that we can ask, another question particularly that we can ask ourselves is, what responsibilities do we have for the systems that we take part in? What responsibility do I have for the factory where my shoes were made? Do I have any responsibility? Did I buy myself out of that when I paid for them? Was it that transaction that ended that responsibility? Or do I have some responsibility to the person whose hands were on this shirt that I never met? And fundamentally, behind this, I want to ask us, to whom are we ultimately accountable? Often we're disconnected from the beneficiaries of our work, particularly when we're doing sort of consulting work. We're often very removed from the communities that are affected by the work we do. And we have these narrowly construed professional ethical guidelines. Engineers are horrible about this. We have these sets of rules that as long as you didn't break them, you're an ethical engineer. And it's sort of like, put my head in the sand, close my ears and eyes, I didn't break any of the rules, we're okay, right? And I think we can go beyond that sort of approach to microethics and start asking, like, hey, we have a prison industrial complex. Maybe I shouldn't be working on prisons. Maybe this is a macro problem that I need to put my energy somewhere else. And it's not about, did I tell the truth and did I do an honest job at work, but it's like, and what were the results of my work? And who benefited and who suffered from the work I'm doing? I think we can reframe this idea of what an innovator is in this process. And I think we can think about, what would it mean to be a critical innovator? One who recognizes the limits of their own expertise and recognizes the limits of the way that they're trained to think, and recognizes the limits of acting based on good intention alone, and instead embracing and engaging in rigorous critique beyond the technical. and considering how we might render the problems that we're tasked to address as political problems, redraw our control volumes, and instead, in fact, draw systems diagrams bringing power, history, context into the frame, and expand the sorts of solutions that are possible. And can we think about changing our professional identities and recognizing, as Howard Zinn put it, you can't stand still on a moving train, that the personal is political, that we're more than just, and this is a particular issue for engineers, often you're like, oh, go call the engineer, sort of like go call the mechanic. And it's like, you're not just a mechanic, you're not just an engineer, you're a person, you're a neighbor, you're a consumer, you're all of these other things, you're potentially a voter, you're all of these other things, and you occupy many different sort of political positions in relation to the projects that you're doing. And I think the identity of the innovator doesn't capture all that we are. And we're not outsiders to the problem we're trying to solve. We're part of that system. And if we're benefiting from the system, we might have to think about, how can I make it so that I don't benefit from a system that causes outcomes that I don't want? How can I remove myself from that place of benefiting from a thing that I don't like the outcome and the effect it has on other people? And the third thing I think we need to do this is really engage in sustained long-term engagement with communities. As opposed to the sort of consulting drop in and out of a problem, instead build relationships with people and work together with people. It's a very different kind of commitment. It's not the drop-in engagement. It's less sort of attractive and engaging in many ways because you're not solving new problems all over the world. Instead, you're doing the hard work of building relationships with people. People that you may not always like. You don't, just because you don't like someone one day doesn't mean you can walk out on them. You're like, no, we're committed to this together. And social justice concerns are not just boxes that we can fix. Oh, we check the employment box over here, we check the poverty box over there. They're parts of processes that require us to have a broader conception of our own professional praxis. It requires us to have a broader framing of what it means to be an innovator. So I want to end on this quote, and I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to ask if anyone knows who said this. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Anyone know who said that? He said it a long, long time ago. And I share this quote to end to basically say, I don't think anything I've said today is new. There's nothing I said today that people long, long ago did not say. And I'm just re-saying the same thing. Here's Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967 talking about machines and computers. And here I am today talking about the same thing when we think about technical fixes to climate. So I think that we can do better and we can do different, and I think it can be a healthy process for all of us. So that's what I have for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I graduated from Presidio before Khalid started teaching there, but now I think I have to re-enroll. Because, do we have any questions for Khalid?
Ask away.
Ask away.
What you're suggesting to me seems like a huge paradigm shift, and will require massive system change, which I'm all for. I don't have time for it. So how do we move in the meantime? How do we make progress along this kind of vector, if you will?
That's a tough one. And if I understand you correctly, you mean you don't have time for it because the climate's changing too quickly. Yeah. My thought is that, and to use a phrase that someone long ago used before me in a way that meant the opposite, I think there is no alternative. That was Maggie Thatcher. And I think that the kinds of rapid changes we need are going to require fierce political commitments. And those political commitments, the only way I've seen those happen is either that money drives them or people drive them. And I think we need people to force the values and the priorities onto the table, but people aren't going to force those onto the table unless we're talking to each other and we're working together. You know, I'm not convinced that those who are benefiting most from these problems are ever going to suddenly just, you know, it's interesting. Ralph Nader wrote a book a few years back, and it's about like the richest people in the world all got together around a table and decided we're going to fix things now. And to me, that was like Ralph Nader's like I give up moment. Because he spent his whole life trying to organize to fight for citizens' rights and consumer rights, and he sort of I felt like he gave up on the democratic process, and he's like, well, now we're just too cut out of it, and the only hope we have is if the richest people all sit down together and wake up. I don't think they're waking up. And I don't think these kinds of changes will happen unless people make them change. So I think that we maybe just need to double down our efforts to get to know one another. And I think about this, like we're all sitting in a room together. And this is a great way that this sort of thing happens, is literally putting our bodies in places and talking to people. But I think the change can happen quickly when we do that. Because I think my own take from teaching a lot of young folks now is that they're starving for this. Because so much of their lives they're being isolated into sort of cubicle machines. And there's a whole side of being human that they're being neglected. And I think that the momentum that comes from this moves very quickly when that's there. So.
Any other, yes. I'll just hold it for you.
Oh. If I knew that the only way to solve the climate problem, the climate crisis, is to forget justice and concentrate on the technologies that you referred to, would you proceed to solve the climate crisis?
Perhaps the obvious response is that I'm going to challenge the premise, because I don't, and I'll explain it though. The reason why I don't think that'll work is because there's no potential for accountability, growth, learning. If a group of experts is making the decisions, then they may get it right once, but how many times until the larger population is not engaged in the process that the ship will go the wrong way? I'm not convinced, and there's a lot of research showing that experts don't actually make better decisions than larger groups of diverse stakeholders. So I'm not convinced that even works that way. And the historical evidence I'll bring to that is thinking about the whole sort of project to develop the so-called underdeveloped world. So much effort has been put into this massive project of intervention in the global south, and it hasn't borne the fruits it claimed it would bear. And I think part of the reason for that is because it's based on a premise that a small number of people that are really understand the problem can solve it. And I think about, and when I teach my students, I use the example of like, I don't want you coming into my house and rearranging my furniture for me. I want to be involved in telling you where I want my couch and where I want my coffee table. And we've often have this sense that, well, let's go to the experts to tell us where the couch should be and the coffee table should be. I think that it neglects the very sort of social process in which we move through the world. So I'm not sure that would actually even do it, you know? And I also worry in the time I spend with technologists is that futurism is deep with them. That sense that we can solve this. And I'm pointing to that is what got us into this mess. That we can rip this out of the ground and burn this fuel and build these great buildings is like, well, that's what created the problem. So I'm no longer on that train anymore. I'm sort of like, can we have a different approach to what we can and maybe can't do? I worry about the lack of prudence in the education of technologists. There's no question about should we do it. There's just if we can, we do it. So, and I'm a little nervous about that. And we see that happening with, right in the tech industry, they're running up against that right now with all the pressure on Google and Amazon about the things that they can do with facial recognition. But the question is, should we be doing this? Is this going to build us a more harmonious society, or is this going to be building us a more surveillance-oriented society? These kinds of questions are questions that I think we can only answer through the liberal arts and not the technical disciplines. So.
So I think to kind of piggyback off of that question, and again, I really appreciated this very anarchist and anti-capitalist presentation up until the point you said profit was an okay motivator, which obviously it's not, because it's what got us into this situation. It's the system we have. It's what we have to work with. But I think a concern that I have as a professional working in the design professions, the really, I mean, a lot of clients we have are very interested in what they can do. The problem is really that we run up against is the city permitting departments and the government organizations that are designed to protect these profit-driven larger institutions and kind of have these slow-moving systems that are predictable even though they don't know their own regulations. The problem being that we run up against them more often than we actually run up against the profit-driven motivations. So I'm curious how beyond, I mean, grassroots organizing and all that, what your thoughts are on, I mean, there are a lot of ways that engineers can and professionals can re-engage with our own morals. How do you see that playing in with systems that aren't even profit motivated, but are kind of derivatives of that are authoritarian in nature that support that system?
I think that, like, to the extent that we have a problem with states not being efficient, not doing what we want, I think the onus is on us. To the extent we live in a democratic society, to recapture those states and make them do what we want to do, you know? Be engaged citizens in that sense and see our space in society as fundamentally as one in which we all have rights upon one another and responsibilities to one another, and what would it mean to live in that democratic society and to be engaged in that way? I would argue that today, like, politics has become a very sort of fringe thing in most people's lives. And to what extent can we re-engage in that conversation about the collective as opposed to the individual? So that's where I'd say, I was stuck with the word. I wouldn't say it's definitely anti-capitalist, not so much anarchist, because I think it has to be more collective, right? In that sense.
I use anarchist in the historical term of Greek direction.
Totally. Yes. Fair. Right. No, we're good. No, I'm with you. Right. And so, like, thinking about the ways in which states move slowly, I think, for reasons because of that prudence. But I agree, and getting back to yours, like, we do need to move more quickly. But how can we as citizenry make those claims upon our states? So I put that back on us as a collective, which is difficult because where do you point that finger? But we need to engage with the and, you know, states can do anything in a time of crisis. They can raise taxes, they can roll the police out on the street and call a curfew. Like, those possibilities exist. And so, not that I want it to be, and I think crisis is a dangerous term because people get away with a lot when they claim crisis, but I think that the possibility is there. There's just barriers to that momentum because there's not enough political will. So, yeah, I'm hopeful about political will.
So given the perspective you sort of raised when we put that drawdown, if you were to go out to dinner with Paul Hawkins, what would you say to him?
I would say thank you, and I would say you're buying dinner, and I think I'd say get out of the way. I'd say step back and let the folks who spoke here at the last lecture, let those young folks step up. And we're seeing that. We're seeing the ways in which, and I struggle with that, and I pause on that because there's a potential for that to be, you know, get rid of the elders and let the young folks make every decision. I think that that's not what I'm trying to get at, but I do think that he's perhaps taking space in a way that he could make that space and make a platform for others given the space he has. I worry a little bit about the ways in which And I would challenge him on that, actually. You benefit from the work you're doing. You get paid from the work you're doing. That's an ethical tension point. How do you navigate that? I would ask him that question. And it's just tricky. I don't know Paul Hawken. I don't know if he lives off of $1 a year and donates every other penny away, right? He might be a saint in that way. But there's a real challenge when, and that's what I was kind of referring to, when those who are developing solutions are also gaining the social and material benefit from the process. That's ethics 101. Now you're conflict of interest. Are you doing it for that? Or are you doing it because you actually believe it's the right solution? So an ethicist would say, let's remove you from the benefit and see if you still do that, right? And so I would challenge that if I would have a conversation with him. I'd love to have that conversation. I'll walk back, yeah.
So understandably, we can't remove technology from your control volume. We just have to recognize what's outside the control volume. However, that being said, there are a number of both practical and theoretical solutions today, everything from circular economies to 100-mile diets to vegan diets, electric transportation, 100% renewable energy, Green New Deals, whatever. What do you think are the most promising and impactful models that are existing?
So there are sort of two angles to that. The one was like, the transportation things, and the other were like circular economy. And I think I would put them in different categories, because one's like a process and way of doing things, the other's a discrete technology. Well, sure, absolutely, totally. I think my knee-jerk would be to go back to the IPCC report where they have this really great chart, and I thought about showing it, but on the chart they show sort of the cost of the mitigation and I can't remember, it's the cost per ton of CO2 mitigated. And there's all of these things that are negative, i.e. there's money to be made by mitigating this way. The most obvious, the number one is insulating our homes better. So I would say that being pragmatic and expedient, start with the things that people can make money off, and let's push those because there's not going to be political resistance. But I think do those while building base, while building a push for we need to change the way we live and rethinking our economic paradigms. And the thing that, and perhaps the most controversial because it runs up against the Green New Deal, I think we need to rethink growth. And that's, 20 years ago, that was a radical thing to say. Today, I think people are coming to terms with that. You just can't grow forever. And I love teaching engineers because I'm like, 3% compounded eternally. What does it look like? And they all go like this. And they're like, exactly. And I'm like, that's the economy you live in. They're like, that's ridiculous. Who did that, right? And so rethinking that question of growth. But what that means is we have to, and this gets a little complicated, we have to rethink our entire monetary system. The basis of how money gets created today depends on growth. Money gets loaned out. You only pay that money back if you make more than you got loaned. And so that locks you into a growth paradigm. The federal government loans money to banks. Banks then loan that out to people. That's the process of money creation in the United States and in most of the world. And so that locks us into a permanent state of growth and requires that just to sustain. So I think we got to rethink that. And I think we need to rematerialize our existence and think about what is the material basis for our economic growth. And this is I teach political economy, and the driver of economic growth in the last 40 years-ish is finance. It's all debt. And there's concern that it's a house of cards. And even someone who I think is a fairly conservative thinker, Robert Reich, pretty famous, but I put him in the relatively conservative boat. He even says, look, all of this economic growth is debt-based. That means it's a house of cards. Like whenever those debts get called in, there's no there. And so I think we need to sort of rematerialize our existence. And that's a social and political economic process. So
we have time for 2 more questions, and I'm actually going to take one of them. So just very interesting, everything that you're saying. And I'm interested, one of the things we do at Acterra is answer the question that individuals have, what can I do? Changing the monetary system is probably not something I can do. but what can my part be in it? And one of the things we do at Acterra, Violet Sienna is in the back of the room, who is the engine behind our Climate Resilient Communities program. And one of the very simple things that we're doing is creating a climate change community team in East Palo Alto, representative with young people, old people, everybody in between, to take ownership of the issue that faces them with regard to sea level rise and climate change. And so this is something, it's not simple, but it's something we can do in the short term. And I'm interested in, I guess somebody asked this in a different way. What are examples of things that you see that could, the people here could leave and say, here's something I can actually do that would make a difference?
To sort of follow in line with the theme, I think it's the things we can do are social and political. And I suspect Violet will have a lot more ideas than I will, but at the root of it, it's show up. Put our bodies in places regularly. An example that I teach is, I suspect you all know the Rosa Parks story, but I wonder what version of that story you know. Most people know a story where a little old lady got really tired one day and sat on the front of the bus and refused to move. That doesn't tell you the true story of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a long-time organizer. She showed up every single week for over a decade to meetings before that happened. That whole process did not happen in some cataclysmic moment when all the stars were aligned and change happened. And that model of change that we get in the Marvel movies, it paralyzes us because we're all waiting for the hero to show up. And it paralyzes young folks because they're all like, do I have to make all the right decisions to end up at the right place at the right time and make the right decision? And there's so much weight on that decision, they're all suffering with anxiety. It's unfair to them and it's unfair to the world. And so I think about, we need to just start showing up. Like on the regular, make that sacrifice to be in places with the people around us, to be in community with folks. And my push would be to be in community with the most marginalized groups that live around us so that we can understand, wow, your life experiences, you move through the same geography is so different from mine, and that doesn't feel good, because I'm betting that won't feel good to any of us, and so we'll want to change that. But I think showing up is really, and that's why, again, like, when you all show up here on a Wednesday night, like, why would you come out on a weeknight at 7 o'clock? And so I think that's the kind of thing we need more of. And so that's where I would say, just don't overthink it. Start showing up, Okay, one more
question. So I like to think that us in this room are generally have the same feelings about these kinds of things, but for people that for people that really have no interest in social justice or anything like that, how beyond like first incentivizing with an easy cost positive solution, how do you get through to them, or like what do you see as an option there?
Another thing I tell my students, so what are you just gonna incarcerate everyone on the other side of the equation? Like you're just doing the same thing now. Like that's not a solution. So I don't think like beating the other side is really, there are moments when there are political battles that have to be won. I totally believe that. But I also think that and this is hard, like being in community with folks who feel differently than us is important. But I think of that more on the side of communities who are facing marginalization, but also on perhaps more politically conservative communities, and understanding I would bet that there are a lot of shared values there. Let's start working from those places. What do we all care about? We all care about family. Okay, we can work with this, right? Like we all have some really common shared values. I think a lot of the resistance is fear to the way of living that people expect and want of going away is one of the reasons for the reactions. I do think those ways of living will have to go away, but how do we do that in a way that's safe? I worry about my students because what's the American dream? It's to have more than your parents, right? You have social mobility. But that's actually impossible if we're trying not to have climate change. Not everyone in the world can have that kind of what we define as social mobility, And so we've set them up to fail, where we've set them up with the sense that you're successful in life if you are socially mobile, and yet we're also telling them that social mobility is actually a really big problem. So they're trapped. They're damned if they do, damned if they don't. So I think working with people around that kind of psychological and social process around, hey, we can actually be really happy and not just make more money. Maybe we can, spend more time doing other things. It manifests in context very different, but I think helping people feel safe and secure as we do these things, I think is at the root of that. So, yeah.
Please join me in thanking Khalid Kadir very much. And are you willing to stay around for a couple of minutes? So if you have more questions, he'll be here. Please enjoy. Thank you very much. See you next month, I hope.